I'll trade my daughter, fat and worthless, for your lands." These words from her father, filled with contempt and desperation, ripped through the market square air, treating her as a mere burden to be exchanged. Amidst the stunned crowd, the mountain man, a reclusive and feared figure, responded, "She is worth more than all of this," thus beginning her rescue from public humiliation. Far from the cruel judgments, the woman, branded by shame, was destined to discover her inner dignity and strength under his silent protection. This public act of degradation branded her a burden to society, initiating a tragic journey tainted by cruelty. The market square, an ideal stage for humiliation, turned the crowd into passive witnesses of her suffering. Every glance, every whisper, intensified a burning sense of shame within her. Exposed to public view, constantly referred to as gorda, fat, she was deliberately dehumanized, her weight serving as a pretext to treat her as a burden and a scound. Symbol of family shame. Society, in its cruelty, judged her solely by appearances, ignoring her inherent dignity and strength. While the world saw her as nothing but cargo to be discarded, internally, the protagonist suffered profound humiliation and despair. Feeling worthless, her father's words and the crowd's gazes intensified her shame. This was the moment her world collapsed, and she was trapped in a spiral of contempt and helplessness. Her thoughts spiraled around the question of whether she was truly just a burden, or if she deserved such cruelty, the very essence of her emotional torment. The crowd's silence, though seemingly neutral, was an act of cruelty as potent as her father's words. The community, which should have protected her, became a silent judge, affirming her status as a burden and a source of shame. The absence of protest reinforced the protagonist's belief that her fate was deserved and her worth non-existent. This collective disregard, expressed through their inaction, deepened her isolation and solidified her conviction of worthlessness, just before a spark of dignity ignited. This passage aimed to capture the absolute nadir of the protagonist's humiliation and helplessness, the moment she believed her fate was sealed, that there was no escape from contempt and being a burden. This was the scene immediately preceding the renegade protector's appearance, emphasizing the dramatic tension and stark contrast. Her inner strength was still dormant, overwhelmed by shame and the cruelty of the world around her. After her father's brutal offer, as the crowd held its breath, he suddenly appeared. A tall, silent mountain man whose name was whispered in fear. He stepped into the square, his presence a wave of cold air, silencing murmurs and sneers. An absolute heavy silence fell, in which only the racing heart of the humiliated Loti could be heard. The crowd drew back, stunned and frightened. No one dared to speak when the mountain man stood opposite her father. Silence was his weapon, and his gaze a promise of something irreversible. Loti's fate, branded cargo, was about to be altered. The mountain man, without a word, approached closer. His eyes rested on Loti, devoid of contempt, merely a cold assessment of the situation. Then he turned to her father. "She is worth more than all this land," he stated, his voice low and calm, carrying the weight of stones. The shocked crowd recoiled. Loti's father attempted to protest, but the mountain man was already producing a handful of silver coins from his pouch, scattering them onto the ground. "I claim her, and let no one dare try to take her back." This was no transaction. It was a declaration that shook the town. Loti, though trembling, felt a tiny spark of hope. Loti stood paralyzed, feeling the crushing weight of the entire community's gaze. Shame burned her cheeks. But then the mountain man approached her. He didn't touch her, nor did he utter a single word that could wound her. Instead, he took off his thick woolen cloak, redolent of smoke and forest, and carefully draped it over her trembling shoulders. It was a simple gesture, but for Loti, who had heard only words of contempt her entire life and been treated as cargo, it was a shocking act of kindness. The cloak's warmth not only heated her body, but also enveloped her wounded soul, offering her the first semblance of safety. With the mountain man's cloak on her shoulders, Loti lifted her head. She didn't look at the crowd's whispers, but at the broad back of the man who had saved her. Without a word, he gestured the way forward. They left the square, leaving behind echoes of cruel laughter. Every step Loti took was uncertain, filled with fear, yet also a new determination. She was afraid of what awaited her, but felt relief at leaving the world that had rejected her. The mountain man walked silently beside her, his presence like a wall, shielding her from the lingering hostility. There were no conversations, only the rustle of the wind. This was an escape, the beginning of a journey into the unknown, where shame could be replaced by dignity and strength. Once they were well outside the town, the mountain man paused. He turned and looked at Loti. It wasn't a gaze filled with desire or pity, but one that was deep, penetrating, and utterly free of judgment. His eyes, so often perceived as cold and unapproachable, seemed to see beyond the fat figure that society so heavily condemned. He saw in her something others overlooked: kindness, sensitivity, a hidden strength. Loti, accustomed to gazes filled with contempt, felt her heart, previously constricted by fear, gently loosen. This brief, wordless glance conveyed to her that for him, she was not cargo, but a human being. After this brief, meaningful glance, the mountain man continued on his way. Loti followed him, feeling that each step distanced her from a past full of humiliation and shame. The path led deep into the forest, away from civilization, towards a distant, mysterious cabin. This place was to become her sanctuary. No verbal promises were made, no assurances of safety. Yet, in his silent presence, in his determined movements, Loti felt secure. She understood that this renegade, though terrifying to the world, was her only hope. It was a silent promise of a new beginning, where she could rediscover her dignity and strength, far from the cruelty of human judgment. As the cart carrying the protagonist and her silent protector left the dusty city streets, the clatter of the wheels carried the echoes of recent jeers and contemptuous glances, burned into her memory of public humiliation. Her heart beat erratically, a mixture of fear for the unknown and relief that she was no longer a public spectacle. The protector drove in silence, his silhouette like an unyielding monolith, inspiring both terror and the first stirrings of uncertain hope within her. She was leaving a world that had rejected her, stepping into a void that felt less threatening than what she had known. The journey to the distant sanctuary was long and arduous. The protagonist, accustomed to being treated as a worthless object, expected the worst. Instead, a profound silence enveloped them, broken only by the clatter of wheels and the sounds of nature. She felt lost and terrified, yet for the first time, she experienced relief at no longer being the target of public contempt. The protector's silence, though weighty, was not menacing. It slowly soothed her nerves and offered the nascent seed of uncertain security. Throughout the arduous journey, the silent protector showed her practical, unspoken respect. When the sun blazed down, he offered her a canteen of water. When the cold seeped into her bones, he covered her with a blanket. His actions spoke louder than words. These small acts of care, initially incomprehensible, slowly crumbled the wall of her terror and distrust. She began to perceive that his presence was not a threat, but a safe haven, strange, yet surer than anything she had known. This was the first step towards regaining her dignity. On this journey, the protagonist battled her inner demons. Memories of her father's cruel words, his contempt, and the crowd's mocking gazes constantly resurfaced like painful shadows. The wind's whisper seemed to echo, fat, worthless, a burden, suffocating her despite the physical distance from her tormentors. Yet the protector's silence and reserved presence slowly carved out space for new thoughts. She began to wonder why this strange man had saved her and what he saw in her that others had overlooked. It was a fragile and uncertain seed of hope sprouting in the barren soil of her humiliation. Fear gave way to uncertainty. After many days of exhausting travel, as the sun began to set, they finally arrived. Before them, nestled amidst dense trees, stood the protector's simple cabin. The sight of this austere place was a shock to the protagonist, utterly different from her cruel life in the town. The log cabin, with its smoking chimney, seemed to promise safety and asylum, yet simultaneously stirred a sense of dread. She looked at it with a mixture of caution and growing curiosity. Could this place, cut off from the world, be her new home? Would she find peace here, away from judgments and contempt? Her heart beat faster, but it was no longer just fear. It was also an unfamiliar feeling of anticipation. The first night in the defender's cabin was full of new experiences. Inside, a silence reigned, neither empty nor menacing. Instead, it was filled with the warmth of the fireplace and the scent of wood. There were no judging glances, only the quiet presence of the defender. A simple meal, prepared without a word, tasted like a feast after humiliation and fear. The protagonist watched him furtively, trying to understand the silent defender's motives. He didn't look at her as a burden, nor did he demand anything. Her body and mind could finally rest from the tension. She felt safe, enveloped by an unspoken acceptance that slowly healed her wounds and paved the way to regaining her dignity. Days in the defender's cabin fell into a rhythm of simple tasks, amidst a silence filled with unspoken understanding. The protagonist, initially wary, learned to interpret the defender's gestures as communication. He respected her space, never pressured her, asked no questions, always ensuring her basic needs: warmth, food, safety. She saw in him not just a rescuer, but a man of deep moral code. This understanding, built on respect and subtle acts of care, formed the foundation of trust. Her fear gave way to certainty that in this place, with this man, she deserved dignity and protection. Upon arriving at the solitary cabin, Loti, marked by public humiliation and the feeling of being a burden, approached her new reality with apprehension. The defender's silent gaze felt like a judgment. Initially clumsy and frightened, she learned the harsh tasks necessary for wilderness survival: chopping wood, carrying heavy water from the icy stream, caring for animals. Every chore was a challenge. Her hands, accustomed to more delicate tasks, quickly blistered and her muscles ached. But each small victory, lighting a fire, baking bread, managing a goat, was a revelation. Her body, once a source of shame, was capable of effort and possessed unexpected strength. The defender's quiet guidance, his patience and lack of judgment made her efforts feel valuable. These were the first steps toward regaining dignity, far from the cruelty of the world that had rejected her. With each passing day, uncertainty dwindled, giving way to quiet satisfaction. In the cabin's seclusion, far from the clamor and cruel stares, Loti experienced a quiet respect. The defender, silent, stern, and shrouded in ill repute, through actions, not words, showed that she was more to him than an acquisition or a goat. Temporary companion. Small yet significant gestures: a warm blanket on a cold night, a larger portion of food, a mended bench by the fireplace. There were no words of comfort or empty promises, only practical, steady care for her comfort and safety, which gradually healed her inner wounds and melted the ice of fear. Loti began to understand that her worth was not measured by society's cruel judgment, which saw her as a burden and a shame, but by the simple, humane treatment from this renegade. These quiet affirmations were like a soothing balm to her humiliated soul, extinguishing the flame of shame and uncertainty, replacing it with a spark of hope and security. In these gestures, she found the dignity others had tried to strip from her. Days in the cabin and wilderness, filled with work and respect, brought Loti not only physical resilience, but a profound inner transformation. She began to see her reflection in the stream's surface or a cracked window pane, not with her former disgust and shame, but with a new curiosity. Her gaze grew more confident. Her shoulders, once hunched under the weight of judgment, straightened, gaining strength. One day, while gathering berries in the sun, the first genuine smile appeared on her face, shy, fleeting, yet sincere and full of an inner light. It was no longer a forced grimace, but a natural expression of joy. She began to hum old melodies, forgotten during her time of humiliation. This was a sign that she was reclaiming a part of herself that society had brutally tried to take away. She stopped feeling like an unwanted dead weight. A strong sense of belonging to this place and the defender, along with a newfound strength that allowed her to look to the future with hope, was born within her. Her dignity, once trampled, now rose anew, radiating from within. With each passing day, Loti, once a burden to the world, more boldly adapted to the harsh wilderness life. Under the defender's watchful eye, she learned tracking, identifying plants, smoking meat, making minor repairs. Her hands, once clumsy, skillfully wielded an axe or a knife, becoming tools of her newfound strength. She became self-sufficient, and her contribution to the cabin's functioning was significant. She no longer merely followed instructions but took initiative, surprising the defender with her resourcefulness. When he returned from hunting, he would find a meal ready, a tool repaired, or supplies sorted. She felt like a full-fledged partner in this small world, not just a rescued individual. The sense of agency, of being needed and appreciated, was crucial for her regained dignity and inner strength. She slowly shed the burden label imposed by society, becoming a woman capable of survival and forging her own destiny. In this role, she found true freedom and worth. Between Loti and the defender, with each day in seclusion, a unique bond developed, one that needed no words. It was a connection based on silence, mutual respect, and a deep understanding extending beyond verbal communication. Long evenings were spent by the fireplace, aware of a comforting presence. Shared meals in silence became a ritual. Working side by side, whether harvesting or repairing the roof, was an act of synchronization and trust. Even watching the sunset or stars together became a profound communication, where glances and gestures spoke more than 1,000 words. She saw in him not just a savior from shame, but a man with his own wounds and a quiet kindness. He perceived her true worth, which no one else in the cruel world had seen. This closeness proved that a true connection is built on a foundation of respect, acceptance, and empathy, not on superficial judgments. Their shared silence was full of understanding and support, creating a sanctuary for their souls. The culmination was Loti's achievement of full self-acceptance, not just physically, which had been the cause of public humiliation and her treatment as a burden, but primarily spiritually and emotionally. She no longer felt like a dead weight. She wasn't ashamed of her body, her past, or her scars. She understood that the cruelty of her father and society was a reflection of their weakness, not her flaws. She stood tall, with her head held high and a gaze full of calm strength, ready to face the world that had rejected her. Her smile was free and authentic. Her voice, once quiet, gained confidence. She was ready to defend herself, her new life, and the shared world built with the defender, founded on respect and dignity. She regained her dignity, becoming a symbol of true inner strength, of fortitude, and an unyielding will to survive, not of external recognition. She was living proof that a person's true worth lies within, regardless of others' judgments. Days in the defender's cabin flowed peacefully, marked by the rhythm of nature and quiet understanding. Loti, once a burden, now felt completely herself. Her smile was sincere and her gaze brave. But one afternoon, as she was gathering herbs, a thin plume of smoke appeared on the horizon, too thick to be from an ordinary campfire. Loti's heart tightened with unease. The defender, standing by the cabin, also noticed it. His face remained impassive, but Loti sensed a change in him. The calm was broken. The shadow of the past seemed to be returning. The defender, without a word, took his axe and headed towards the forest, from where the smoke billowed. Loti watched him with growing dread. In the evening he returned, his face covered in soot, and a grave seriousness was etched in his eyes. "The town is burning," he said curtly, his voice low, like the whisper of the wind. These words hit Loti like a physical blow. Images of the cruel marketplace, of humiliation, and of being a burden returned with double force. She felt the old shame trying to engulf her once more. But this time, the defender stood beside her, and his silent presence was like a shield. More days passed, marked by unease and the distant smell of burning. Loti and the defender prepared supplies, ready for the worst. And the worst arrived. One morning, desperate, grimy figures appeared on the forest path, people from the town. The very ones who had once looked at her with contempt, calling her a burden, now, marked by the cruelty of fate, sought help. Their eyes, once full of judgment, now pleaded. Loti felt a mix of fear, triumph, and pity. The defender stood beside her, silent, his gaze like stone. Faces that had once contorted in scorn were now etched with hunger and fear. Loti felt her newfound strength and dignity collide with the echoes of past humiliation. Did those who had shown her cruelty deserve help? The defender remained impassive, and Loti knew the decision rested with both of them. One of the men, a once haughty merchant, stepped closer, his voice trembling. "We beg for your help, Loti. The city burned. We have nothing left. We plead for shelter, for food." Loti looked at him, recalling how he himself had mocked her in the marketplace. The irony of the situation was searing. Those who had once treated her as a burden now found themselves begging for survival from the very people they had scorned. The price of their salvation wasn't silver, but the acknowledgement of her dignity and strength, which they had so cruelly tried to strip from her. The protector, as always, remained silent. His gaze moved from Loti to the desperate faces of the newcomers, lingering on each without a hint of judgment or pity. There was no anger or triumph in him, only the cold, analytical gaze of someone weighing consequences. Loti sensed that in this silence, something far greater than a simple decision to help was unfolding. It was a test of their shared world, built on dignity and strength, far removed from scorn. His silence was a promise of justice, yet also of an unavoidable decision. The city, once vibrant and filled with judging eyes, now lay in ruins, consumed by fire. Thick smoke billowed, irritating throats and eyes, and the echo of screams and despair hung heavy in the air. The very people who had scornfully looked down on the wronged woman, calling her a burden and rejecting her due to her appearance, were now homeless and terrified. In an act of ultimate desperation, their faces streaked with dirt and tears, they began to drag themselves toward the only place that could offer them shelter, the hut of the dispossessed protector, where the wronged woman lived. Their once proud postures were stooped, and their eyes avoided looking up. It was a humiliation they had brought upon themselves, forced to beg for help from those they had so cruelly cast aside. The wronged woman, standing beside the silent protector, felt old wounds and newfound strength warring within her heart. She saw their fear, their shame, but also remembered the cruelty of their words and the mercilessness of their judgments. She knew it was time to confront the past, not as a victim, but as a woman who had found her dignity. The protector stood unwavering, his gaze like steel, his presence a silent challenge, a wall they had to overcome. This was the first, deeply tense encounter that would decide everything. When the townspeople reached the hut, their pleas for help were quiet and uncertain, laden with shame. The initial confrontation wasn't a fight with fists, but a battle of words and gazes. The wronged woman, whose voice once trembled, now spoke with newfound strength. She didn't shout in anger, but with dignity reminded them of their cruelty, of how they had treated her as a burden, as an object of exchange. Her words, simple and direct, struck harder than any blow, exposing the community's hypocrisy. You called me fat, worthless, you sold me like an animal. Where were you when I needed help? Where was your pity when you humiliated me? She asked, her voice calm but firm. In her eyes, there was no hatred, but sadness and an unyielding self-possession. She showed them that she was no longer the same woman they knew, the one they had broken. They understood that they could no longer demand from her or command her. This was the moment the wronged woman reclaimed control of her story, forcing them to confront the consequences of their own scorn. The shame on the townspeople's faces was all too evident, and their silence was undeniable proof of her moral victory. Throughout this tense exchange, the dispossessed protector remained silent, yet his presence was powerful, like a rock. He didn't need to say a word. His watchful gaze and posture spoke volumes. He stood by the wronged woman's side, providing invisible support that amplified her words. When the townspeople tried to explain or justify themselves, his gaze was like a blade cutting through their lies. It was he, through his earlier actions, who had proven her worth when no one else would. Now, his silence was a defense of her dignity. If he were to speak, it would only be to reinforce her position, making it clear that any further attempts to humiliate her would be met with his firm response. His actions always spoke louder than words. In that moment, his silent acceptance and unwavering support were a clear signal to the entire community. The wronged woman was no longer alone, no longer defenseless. She was protected and respected, and her worth undeniable. It was physical and moral backing that allowed the wronged woman to stand tall, knowing she had unwavering strength behind her. Under the influence of the wronged woman's words and the protector's silent strength, the wall of hypocrisy surrounding the townspeople began to crumble. The pain and fear they felt from losing their homes merged with the shame of their past actions. They began to see the wronged woman not as a fat daughter or a burden, but as a person of unwavering dignity and strength. Some bowed their heads in silence. Others began to whisper words of remorse. This was their moral defeat, not through physical force, but through the wronged woman's truth and unwavering resolve. An antagonist, perhaps a survivor of the fire who still tried to undermine her position, was silenced by his own neighbors who now saw him in a different light. The community, compelled by circumstances and their own consciences, abandoned their prejudices. They understood that a person's true worth lay not in appearance or status, but in their hearts and character, in their ability to survive and maintain dignity in the face of cruelty. This was a crucial turning point, where the wronged woman symbolically shed the burden of her past, and the community began to recognize its own profound errors. After the emotional breakthrough, it was time for action. The wronged woman, instead of triumphing over the humbled community, demonstrated her true strength and compassion. With the help of the protector, who remained her quiet support, she began to organize aid for those in need. She had, after all, learned how to survive and care for herself in the hut, so she now put those skills to use. She prepared meals for the hungry, tended to the burns and wounds of the injured, and her calm demeanor and composure were a source of comfort. The townspeople, once scornful, now humbly accepted her help, and some even offered their own, working alongside her. They watched her work tirelessly, how her hands, which they once considered clumsy, now skillfully and carefully tended to those in need. Their collective effort to mitigate the fire's aftermath became an act of rebuilding not only the city, but also trust and mutual respect. In these truly difficult times, the lines between us and them inevitably began to blur, replaced by a shared overriding purpose. As the last flames died down and the city slowly began to rise, it was time for quiet reflection. The wronged woman and the protector found themselves alone, in the tranquility of their huts, watching the sunrise over the recovering land. No words were needed. Their gazes spoke volumes. They had journeyed together through a hell of humiliation, loneliness, and struggle to find each other and their own unwavering strength. The protector took her hand, his grip firm and full of promise. In that gesture, there was more love and respect than in all the words she had ever heard from the world. They understood that their future was intertwined, built on mutual trust and the dignity they had reclaimed together. The wronged woman, once sold like a burden, was now free, strong, and loved. The protector, once a renegade, had found his place by her side. It was a scene of quiet yet profound commitment, sealing their shared journey. They knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together, as equal partners who had unyieldingly proven that a person's true worth is invisible to the eyes, but not to the heart. Let us remember that a person's true worth is not defined by society's cruel judgments. Our heroine, initially a burden and a disgrace, found dignity and strength in the gaze of one who saw her soul. Do we not all deserve to be seen for who we truly are? The story shows how the quiet protection and love of the dispossessed protector became a catalyst for her. It was not a change within herself, but the discovery that someone could see her true essence beyond the world's cruelty. True affection overturns stereotypes and grants the strength to write one's own story. Overcoming imposed disgrace is the journey our heroine embarked on. Have you ever felt similarly? This tale proves that strength lies in the courage to rise and author your own narrative. Your past does not define your future. It only shows how far you've come. The irony of fate. The community that rejected the heroine and treated her with scorn found themselves begging for help in the face of disaster. It reminds us that the world often disregards what may later prove to be its salvation. True worth often hides where we least expect it. Where are you tuning in from tonight? What part touched your heart the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story about dignity and strength, don't go anywhere. The next story is waiting just for you. See you in the next episode.